I have known Renata since I was 11 years old, and for 17 of those years, I never once let myself finish a thought about her. She was my best friend Owen's mother. She made our lunches on summer afternoons, drove us to baseball practice, sat at every birthday I had between fourth grade and college. She was a fixture of my childhood the way a kitchen table is a fixture, present, reliable, not something you examine. Then Owen moved to Denver for work, and I kept coming back to that house anyway. And somewhere in the space where Owen used to be, I started seeing his mother as a woman instead of a fact of my childhood. I'm telling you this honestly because the story does not work if I pretend it arrived suddenly. It didn't. It built for a year, in small moments neither of us spoke about, until one evening on her porch, neither of us could pretend any longer. This is what happened in that year.
I had been coming to this house since I was 11 years old, and it had not changed much in 17 years. Same covered porch, same 2 wooden rocking chairs that Renata refinished every few summers, same garden along the side yard where she grew tomatoes that never quite ripened in the Portland clouds, but that she planted every spring anyway. When Owen moved to Denver that March, I assumed my reason for visiting had left with him. It hadn't, as it turned out. Renata called 2 weeks later to ask if I could help carry a bookshelf up from her basement, and I said yes without really thinking about why a 31-year-old man would need a 28-year-old former family friend to carry furniture rather than simply hiring someone. I carried the bookshelf. We had coffee afterward on the porch. It was easy in the way it had always been easy, and I drove home and didn't think much of it. 2 weeks after that, she texted to ask if I wanted to come look at a fence post that had come loose. I came, I fixed the fence post, we had coffee on the porch again, and this time the conversation ran almost 2 hours, and I drove home and thought about it the entire way. I started noticing things about Renata that I had apparently never let myself notice in 17 years. The way she listened, fully, without already composing her response, was something I had taken for granted as just how mothers were. It wasn't. I had friends my own age who didn't listen like that. She asked questions that meant she'd actually heard what I said the first time, and she remembered details from conversations weeks earlier without being reminded. She was 43. She had been divorced from Owen's father for 9 years, and she ran a small architecture practice out of a converted garage behind the house, and she had opinions about everything from city zoning to the right way to prune a fig tree, and she defended every one of those opinions with a directness that I found myself looking forward to all week. I noticed the gray starting at her temples and thought it suited her rather than aged her. I noticed she laughed with her whole face. I noticed, on a Tuesday evening in May, that I had started finding reasons to visit twice a week instead of once, and that none of the reasons were really about fence posts or bookshelves. I didn't say any of this out loud. I told myself it was simply that I missed Owen, and that visiting his mother was the closest available substitute for a friendship I'd lost to geography. I did not believe myself, even as I was thinking it. In June, she asked me to help her build a new raised bed for the garden, and I spent a Saturday afternoon in old jeans with dirt under my fingernails, and she worked beside me in a way that made the labor feel less like a favor and more like something we were building together. At one point, she reached past me for a trowel, and her shoulder brushed mine, and neither of us moved away immediately. It lasted maybe 2 seconds longer than it needed to. I felt it the rest of the afternoon. We finished the bed as the light went long and gold across the yard. She straightened up, wiped dirt from her hands onto her jeans, and looked at the finished bed with real satisfaction, the kind of pride people have in something they made with their hands. Then she looked at me. Not at the garden bed. At me. It was a brief look, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but something passed in it that neither of us was prepared to name. I felt my pulse change. I looked away first, made a comment about needing to wash up, and the moment closed itself the way moments do when neither person is ready. But I thought about that look the entire drive home. I thought about it for days.
I almost didn't call her that Thursday in July. I had spent 3 days deciding I needed to put some distance between us. Not because anything had happened, but because I was old enough to recognize what it meant that I kept finding reasons to be near a woman 17 years older than me who'd once packed my school lunches. I sat in my apartment with my phone in my hand for 20 minutes before I called her anyway, telling myself it was just to check in. She answered on the second ring, and her voice did something to my chest that I had stopped trying to explain away. We talked for an hour and a half about nothing important: a documentary she'd watched, a client who was being difficult, a recipe she wanted to try. It was ordinary conversation, the kind we'd had dozens of times. But near the end of the call there was a pause, longer than usual. And into that pause she said, quietly, "I'm glad you called." "I almost didn't," I said, more honestly than I meant to be. "I know," she said. I could tell. Neither of us asked what she meant by that. We said goodnight. I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward, listening to the rain, understanding that whatever this was, it was not something either of us could keep calling ordinary much longer.
She invited me for dinner the following week, and it was different from the casual coffees and the fence posts and the garden bed. She had cooked something that took real effort. She had opened a bottle of wine she said she had been saving. We sat at her kitchen table, the one I'd eaten at 100 times as a teenager, and the conversation moved slower than usual, with more space between sentences, as though we were both choosing our words with more care than the evening strictly required. At one point I asked her, directly, why she'd called me about the bookshelf in the first place. She could have hired someone. She could have asked a neighbor. She set down her wine glass and looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because I wanted an excuse to see you," she said. I'd been trying to figure out how to say that for 2 weeks, and a bookshelf was the easiest version of it. I didn't say anything right away. I felt something open in my chest, something I had been holding shut for months out of a sense that it wasn't allowed. "I'd been telling myself this was about missing Owen," I said. "Has it been?" she asked. "No," I admitted. "Not for a while." She nodded, slowly, like she already knew, like she had just needed to hear me say it. We took the rest of the wine out to the porch after dinner, and we sat in the 2 rocking chairs the way we had a dozen times that summer. Except this time the silence between us carried weight instead of ease. I told her what I had been avoiding telling her for months, that I thought about her more than I had let myself admit, that I looked forward to seeing her in a way that had stopped being explainable as friendship sometime around May, that I knew exactly how complicated this was and had tried repeatedly to talk myself out of it. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark street. "I'm 43, she finally said. "I was your mother's friend before I was your friend. I watched you grow up in this house." She paused. "I have told myself every version of why this is a bad idea, more times than I can count." "I know. And none of it has made me stop thinking about you," she said. Which is its own kind of answer, I think. The porch light hummed faintly above us. Neither of us moved for a long moment. Then she reached over, in the space between the 2 rocking chairs, and put her hand over mine. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that for a long time, not saying anything else. The night settling around the house on Belmont Street, both of us finally letting ourselves feel the thing we had spent a year pretending not to feel. The weeks after that were not simple. And I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend love erased the complications. She called Owen first, before either of us told anyone else, because she said he deserved to hear it from her, and not as gossip from someone else. I don't know exactly what was said on that call. She came back into the kitchen afterward and sat down heavily and didn't speak for a few minutes, and I didn't push her to. He needs time, she said eventually. That's fair. I'd need time too, if it were reversed. It took Owen 4 months to call me directly. When he did, the conversation was careful and a little stiff, the way conversations are between people who used to know exactly how to talk to each other and are relearning it. He didn't forgive easily, and I didn't expect him to. But he didn't disappear either, and that mattered more than I can fully explain. My own mother, when I told her, was quieter than I expected, processing it in her own way before she eventually said only that she trusted me to know my own life. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was something more useful. Patience. None of it was easy. I want to be clear about that. But none of it made the thing between us feel like a mistake either. A year after we built that garden bed, the tomatoes were finally doing what Portland tomatoes rarely do, actually ripening, full and red on the vine, because Renata had finally figured out exactly which corner of the yard got enough sun. We stood looking at them together on a warm evening, much like the one when she'd first looked at me, and I'd looked away. This time, neither of us looked away. She leaned into me, and I put my arm around her. And we stood there in the garden we'd built with our hands, in the yard I had been coming to since I was 11 years old. And I thought about how strange and unhurried love can be. How it can sit quietly in a friendship for 17 years before anyone notices it's there, and then once noticed, refuse to be unseen again. Owen came to dinner that week, for the first time at the house since everything had changed. It was careful and a little awkward, but real. And at the end of the evening, he hugged his mother goodbye the way he always had and shook my hand in a way that meant something was beginning to heal. I don't know what the next 17 years hold. I know that I am no longer pretending about anything, and that the porch light on Belmont Street still hums faintly in the evenings, and that some Tuesdays I still find an excuse to visit, except now I don't need one.
There's a particular kind of quiet that exists between two people who no longer need to fill silence with anything. We have that now, most evenings, on the same porch where everything became honest. The rocking chairs sit closer together than they used to. There's a blanket she keeps folded on the porch rail for when the Portland evenings turn cool in October. I think sometimes about the version of myself who sat in his apartment kitchen for 20 minutes deciding whether to call her, terrified of what it might mean if he did. I am grateful to him, in a strange way, for calling anyway. Renata says she thinks love like this, the kind that builds slowly inside something that already exists, rather than arriving as a sudden spark with a stranger, asks more honesty of you than the other kind. You cannot hide behind newness. You have to actually look at the person and at yourself and decide if what you feel is real or just convenient. We decided it was real. We are still deciding that actually every ordinary evening on this porch, which I've come to understand is what real love mostly is. Not a single decision, but 1,000 small ones repeated on rocking chairs and gardens, over coffee that's gone cold because the conversation mattered more. I'm 30 years old now, sitting on the porch of the house on Belmont Street, watching the streetlights come on one by one along the block. Renata is beside me, her hand resting easily in mine the way it has for 2 years now, no longer something either of us has to think about or decide. She's reading something on her phone and laughing quietly at it, and I am simply watching her laugh, which I've learned is one of my favorite things in the world to watch. I think about that 11-year-old who first walked up these porch steps carrying a backpack looking for his best friend. He had no idea what this house would eventually mean to him or who in it he would eventually love. Some things take 17 years to become clear. I used to think that was a long time to wait for something. I don't think that anymore. I think it was exactly as long as it needed to be.